So for the 39th class, we learned about the U.S. War with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. And if you were absent, we started off with a previously on to check to see if we learned what we should have the last couple of classes, what changed in the 1840s, and you can see the expansion of America. And then we revisited some of the major sections and the word antebellum before the Civil War. And this is the old stuff here, and this is the new stuff to the right that we learned in class. And we reminded ourselves about manifest destiny, this philosophy that people had, that the entire country belonged to Americans. It didn't matter who was in the way, and we were going to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, hell or high water, that philosophy. And then we dug into Mexico, and we did a 10 and 10 where I gave people 10 minutes to find out as much as they could about Mexico. We've done 10 and 10s before. It's one of my favorite tools. You know that already. And when we pooled our findings, you had some people who focused on the old stuff, the world history stuff, the Aztec history, the Mesoamerican history, Mexico City. Some people focused more on the Spanish involvement, conquistadors, smallpox, that part of the story. The Mexican Revolution and foreign involvement, their fight for independence. Some people focused on food, dress, language, culture, music, that sort of thing. And then some people looked at modern issues, for example, immigration policy and dreamers in present time. It's all correct, but I wanted to give a bigger context about what Mexico was all about and the history of Mexico. And once we did those preliminary items in class, we focused on one chapter of the history, the U.S. War with Mexico. And it begins with Texas, really. And to this day, obviously, Texas is adjacent to Mexico. And Texas is a very unique state. Of all of our states, it's a very unique history, and it relates to the U.S.-Mexican War. So Americans began moving into Texas in the 1820s and brought slaves with them. Now, war was fought by Texans against Mexico because they believed their rights had been violated. Okay, the Mexicans didn't feel their rights had been violated. And it was won by Texans in 1836 and request to enter the United States. And key figures in Texas independence, here's Sam Houston. Obviously, Houston's an enormous town in Texas. The capital of Texas is Stephen Austin. And Texas became an independent country. And just a little life advice, I have been to Texas. The people of Texas take this Battle of the Alamo really seriously. So if you're in Texas, don't clown around about this. They take it really, really seriously. And the Battle of the Alamo during Texas's war for independence from Mexico lasted 13 days in February and March of 1836. In December of 1835, a group of Texan volunteer soldiers had occupied the Alamo, a former Franciscan mission, that's a type of priest, located near the present-day city of San Antonio. On February 23rd, a Mexican force numbering in the thousands and led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna began a siege of the fort. Though vastly outnumbered, the Alamo's 200 defenders, commanded by James Bowie and William Travis, and included the famed frontiersman Davy Crockett, held out for 13 days before the Mexican forces finally overpowered them. For Texans, the Battle of the Alamo became an enduring symbol of their resistance to oppression and their struggle for independence, which they won later that year. The battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," later became popular during the Mexican-American War of 1846 and 1848. Okay? Now, Texas, in the end, like I said, emerged victorious, and Santa Anna was forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco after losing at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836. So Texas became an independent country, which is news to most people when I teach this. And Americans waited 10 years to annex Texas because of the issue of slavery and to avoid war with Mexico. So America kind of let Texas be for a few years before they figured out what to do with them. And eventually, Texas does become a state. But President Jackson and Van Buren refused to recognize Texas because, like I said, the statehood would involve slavery, and they didn't want to touch it. They kind of were passing the buck to future presidents. Texas became its own country with Sam Houston as president from 1836 to 1848, and Mexico never did recognize the independence of Texas. And Texas eventually did enter the state in 1845, and Mexico vowed if Texas became part of the U.S., this would be an act of war. So it was part of the U.S. and it was a war, one of the causes of the War of Mexico of 1846. And before we get into the full war, the Slidell Mission in November of 1845, this was Mexican recognition of the Rio Grande as the Texas-U.S. border. And the U.S. would forgive American citizens' claims against the Mexican government. The U.S. would purchase New Mexico for $5 million, and the U.S. would pay for California at any price. So that was the mission of Slidell. But eventually it did spill out into war, 1846 to 1848, and you can see this map that we went over in class. And President Polk and the Senate got things started. Okay, in May of 1846, the Senate voted 40-2 to go to war with Mexico, and the president at the time, James K. Polk, accused Mexican troops of having attacked Americans on U.S. soil north of the Rio Grande. But Mexico claimed this land as its own territory and accused the American military of having invaded. So poking the bear, you need a good catalyst for war, and this was a good catalyst for the war that Polk did. And here were the causes and the effects. The causes were disputes between the U.S. and Mexico over claiming Texas as part of the Louisiana Purchase, the idea of manifest destiny, Mexican president's refusal to meet with the U.S. envoy to discuss the U.S. purchase of California territory, Mexico's refusal to recognize the independence of Texas, and the annexation of Texas in 1845. Like I said, the Mexicans consider that an act of war. And then the effects. Mexico ceded the U.S. more than 500,000 square miles of territory, including California, Utah, Nevada, most of New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and took over Mexicans' debt owed to American citizens. The dream of manifest destiny was realized, and it revived the question of slavery in new states, put slavery on the forefront. And some key people and events, General Zachary Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready, became our 12th president because of his actions of a war hero. His fellow General Old Fuss and Feathers Scott, enters Mexico, and he became political as well. But Taylor did win the presidency. And then the siege of Veracruz, a 20-day siege of the key Mexican beachhead seaport of Veracruz during the Mexican-American War. It began with the first large-scale amphibious assault conducted by the U.S. military forces and ended with the surrender and occupation of the city. So those are some key events. The Wilmot Proviso, this is a total AP sort of addendum to the lesson. But the Wilmot Proviso, let me give you the simplified version. I have the primary source here, but to simplify it for you, Congressman Wilmot was a proviso to prohibit slavery in the territory acquired by the United States at the conclusion of the Mexican War. Obviously, some congressmen were happy about that, those who were against slavery and those who did not care for abolitionists and those who were for slavery. So we can see the writings on the wall with the Civil War, okay? So eventually, the U.S.-Mexican War ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico gave up claims to Texas above the Rio Grande. Mexico gave the U.S. California and New Mexico. U.S. gave Mexico $15 million and agreed to pay the claims of American citizens against Mexico, about $3.5 million. It was a good deal for America, not so much for Mexico. $3.65 per square mile, that is pretty cheap real estate. And so it was not a good deal for the Mexicans. It was a good deal for America. It allowed us to grow very quickly. And the results, again, 17-month war cost $100 million, 13,000 American lives, mostly due to disease. New territories were brought into the Union, which forced the explosive issue of slavery to the center of national politics. These new territories would upset the balance of power between North and South, created two popular Whig generals who ran for president. Taylor won but died in office without making any progress really toward national unity. Civil War would be 18 years after his passing, and manifest destiny is partially realized. That dream of sea to shining sea is getting closer. Okay, so that's a little breakdown of what we learned about in class, and the assignment is the following. Please take notes on what we just went over, and then answer this one question in AP style, not briefly. Give me your best effort. Considering U.S. actions in Texas and California, was the Mexican-American War a land grab? Why or why not? Okay, so that is that, and I appreciate you watching.